My husband abandoned me in the hospital just hours after I gave birth to our twins. And the last thing he said before he turned his back on me was, "We don't belong in the same world." My name is Adeline Rowe. Even now, I still remember his face in that moment. It was not the face of a man making a terrible decision under unbearable pressure. No, it was the face of a man who had rehearsed his betrayal in advance and just did not have the courage to look at the damage he had done. I used to think my life would follow a completely different path. I was a young interior designer with real potential, a steady career, a good eye, and enough discipline to build something meaningful on my own. I did not come from money, but I came from something I once believed mattered more: honesty, self-respect, and the kind of upbringing that teaches you to look in the mirror without shame. Then I met Cedric Vale. At first, I had no idea he was the heir to one of the largest real estate empires in the city. He appeared in my life like a thoughtful, composed man who saw people instead of status. I met him at the launch of a luxury model home my firm had designed. While everyone else talked in budgets and square footage, Cedric stopped in front of a walnut accent wall and asked me why I had fought so hard to keep it when the client wanted imported stone instead. I told him a beautiful space is not the one that impresses you when you walk in. It is the one that makes you want to come home. He looked at me for a second longer than politeness required. Then he smiled. That smile became the beginning of the worst mistake of my life. Cedric pursued me like I was the one real thing in a life built on polished boardrooms, family expectations, and power plays. Flowers arrived at my office. He waited outside when I worked late. He texted me at midnight just to ask whether I had eaten. He made me believe that underneath the tailored suits and the famous last name, he was still just a man who knew how to love and how to choose. I was wrong. The first person who never believed in me was his mother, Vivian Vale. The first time I met her, I brought a box of homemade pastries because I thought it was the polite thing to do. Vivian looked me up and down with the kind of elegant contempt that does not need volume to wound. She touched the ribbon on the box and said, with a smile so perfect it felt cruel, "How lovely. You really are so simple." I remember the silence after that. I also remember Cedric squeezing my hand under the table as if to tell me not to react. I listened to him. That was something I did far too often in that marriage. After the wedding, I moved into the Vale estate and learned very quickly that while Cedric might have been the heir on paper, Vivian was the one who decided who belonged and who did not. Everything in that house was immaculate, expensive, and cold. High ceilings, quiet stuff, furniture chosen more for legacy than comfort. And Vivian, always present, even when she was not speaking. One phone call from her could change Cedric's schedule. One raised eyebrow from her could silence an entire dinner table. I understood almost immediately that if I was ever going to lose my place in that family, it would not be Cedric who pushed me out first. It would be her. When I found out I was pregnant with twins, I made the mistake of hoping. I really believed 2 babies might soften the edges of that house. Cedric held me, touched my stomach, smiled when the babies kicked, and promised me things would be different now. He said no one would come between us again. He said we would move out after the birth. He said he was tired of living under his mother's control. I believed every word. But the closer I got to my due date, the more wrong everything felt. Cedric grew tense and distracted. He vanished into long private meetings with Vivian in the study. Every time I walked in, conversations ended. Vivian started speaking in those polished, poisonous half-sentences about family responsibility, timing, and the company's image. One afternoon, she set her teacup down and asked me calmly, "Have you ever wondered how much he has to sacrifice because of you?" I knew exactly who she meant, and I knew what she was reminding me of. In her eyes, I was never truly Cedric's wife. I was an inconvenience. The night I gave birth, it was raining hard enough to rattle the windows. The delivery room was too white, too bright, too cold. I was exhausted, shaking, barely holding on to consciousness after hours of labor. But when I heard the first cry and then the second, everything else disappeared. A boy, a girl, 2 tiny lives so small and fragile that my chest hurt from how fiercely I loved them the moment I saw them. I waited for Cedric. I waited for him to come to my bedside, look at our children, and become who I had spent all those months believing he would be. But when the door opened, he stayed at the foot of the bed. He did not come closer. He did not touch the babies. He did not kiss my forehead. He just stood there, hands in his coat pockets, pale as if he had already signed away something human inside himself. "Adeline," he said, his voice flat and dry, "you need to understand." I looked at him. Then I looked at the half-open door behind him. Vivian was standing in the hallway. She did not step inside. She did not need to. In that moment, I understood everything. Cedric had not come alone. He had brought his mother's will with him. Maybe his own cowardice too. "Understand what?" I asked. He would not meet my eyes. "I can't do this. The company is in a very sensitive position. My family cannot afford a situation like this becoming public right now." A situation. I looked down at my newborn children, then back at the man who had once sworn he would protect me for the rest of his life. "Did you just call your children a situation?" His jaw tightened. "Don't make this harder than it already is. You know we don't belong in the same world." That sentence went through me like glass. Not because it shocked me, but because somewhere deep down, I think I had been afraid of that exact moment for a very long time. I had just been too in love to name it. I pulled my babies closer into my arms. My whole body was shaking from pain, rage, humiliation, and heartbreak. But when I spoke, my voice came out cold and steady. From this moment on, I said, "You do not get to call yourself their father." Cedric closed his eyes for the briefest second. Then he turned and walked away. No argument. No pleading. No remorse strong enough to keep him in the room. He left me in that hospital bed with our newborn twins and a heart that had just been crushed beyond recognition. The next morning, I found out something even worse. That betrayal had not happened in a moment of weakness. It was the final step in a plan they had made long before I ever went into labor. The next morning, while I was still trying to get Jonah to latch and settle Elsie to sleep, a woman in a gray suit walked into my hospital room carrying a slim leather folder and a smile that was much too professional to be comforting. She introduced herself as legal counsel for the Vale family. Before I could tell her to leave, she had already opened the folder, laid out a stack of papers, and said in a soft, practiced tone, "The Vale family would like to handle everything discreetly and peacefully so as not to damage any parties involved." Any parties involved. I looked at my two babies lying beside me. My body still hurt. My hair was damp. My stomach cramped every time I moved. And this woman stood there speaking as if she were discussing a contract adjustment instead of the destruction of a family. "They're prepared to cover your hospital expenses," she continued. "In addition, there will be temporary housing assistance and financial support for the children, provided you sign a confidentiality agreement and refrain from any public actions that could harm the family's reputation." I picked up the papers. At first, all I saw was legal language. Smooth, polished, sterile, and disgusting. But then my eyes landed on the dates. These documents had not been prepared overnight. They had been drafted days earlier. My hands went cold. That meant that while I was still pregnant, still folding baby clothes, still believing I was about to bring my children home to a real family, they had already been sitting somewhere planning the cleanest possible way to erase me. "Get out," I said. The woman barely blinked. "You should think carefully. This is the best offer you are likely to receive." I said, "Get out." She looked at me for a moment, then calmly gathered the papers, returned them to her folder, and stood. Before leaving, she turned back and said, "Sometimes signing early makes the future much easier, Ms. Rowe." Then she closed the door behind her. I stared at that door and felt the full truth rising inside me, cold and sharp. Cedric had not been cornered at the last minute. He had known. Maybe he hesitated. Maybe he suffered. Maybe he lost sleep. But he knew. He knew while he sat beside me folding tiny onesies. He knew while he kissed my stomach at night. He knew while he let me believe that no matter how cruel his mother was, he would never abandon his wife and children. I named my son Jonah Rowe. I named my daughter Elsie Rowe. I dropped the name Vale. It was the first thing I did that made me feel like I still had control over something. For the next 2 days in the hospital, I called Cedric over and over again. At first, the calls rang out. Then his phone went off. Then my number was blocked. I sent emails. No reply. I wrote a handwritten letter, not to beg, just to ask him one thing. Did you really look at your children and still believe this was the right choice? The letter came back 3 days later, marked refused. By then, I had no illusions left. My father, Martin Rowe, came to take us home in his old blue-gray car. I still remember seeing him standing in the hallway in wet shoes, his eyes red, and feeling for a second like I might collapse into tears like a child. But I did not. I just stood there while he put his coat around my shoulders and lifted Jonah with shaking hands, like he was holding something holy. "Let's go home," he said. I thought at least I still had my old apartment, the one Cedric had paid for before the marriage. It was not huge, but it was warm, and I had imagined bringing the babies there, laying them in their crib, and beginning again. But when we pulled up outside the building, the manager was already waiting under the awning. He would not look me in the eyes when he told me the lease had been terminated the week before. All of my belongings had been packed and moved into temporary storage. The fees were covered for 30 days. The week before? I asked. He nodded. The week before. While I had still been heavily pregnant. Still arranging baby clothes in drawers. Still believing I would come home after the hospital. They had already removed the roof over my head. It was not a last-minute decision. It was not panic. It was not a family argument that spiraled. It was strategy. My father took the 3 of us back to his small one-story house on the edge of town. The house had a worn porch, faded cream walls, and a narrow spare bedroom that had once been mine. He cleared it out fast and somehow made room for 2 cribs. It was cramped enough that I could barely turn around without hitting something. But there were no lawyers there. No silent staff moving around like ghosts. No mother-in-law watching me like I was contamination. Just me, my father, and my babies. Those first weeks were a quiet kind of hell. Jonah cried at night. Elsie's skin broke out if anything irritated her. My body ached. My back burned. My dignity felt skin raw. Some nights I held one baby, rocked the other crib with my foot, and then slid down to the floor because I was too exhausted to stay standing. Diapers, formula, medicine, gas, electricity. Everything came at me at once. I had once been a woman who led design meetings and pitched concepts to clients with confidence. Now I stood in grocery aisles calculating whether buying the better formula meant I would not have enough left for eggs. When the babies were still very small, I tried to return to work. I told myself that at least my talent was still there. But at every interview, I was no longer seen as a promising designer. I was a single mother with infant twins, no husband, no stable support system, and a life that looked too complicated. Nobody said I was a problem. They just used softer words. I started taking whatever work I could. Freelance renderings, product descriptions, layout corrections, anything I could do while caring for 2 newborns. And then one night, while sitting under a dull yellow kitchen light, mending one of Jonah's worn little sleeper suits, I looked over at my mother's old sewing machine in the corner. I stood up, wiped the dust off it, and laid my hand on the cold metal. I had no idea then that I was touching the thing that would save the 3 of us. I thought I was repairing baby clothes. I did not realize I was about to stitch my life back together. That sewing machine was so old that every time I pressed the pedal, the whole thing shook and rattled like it resented being dragged out of storage after years of silence. It had belonged to my mother. She used it for curtains, hems, pillowcases, table linens, and the little practical repairs that quietly hold a home together. As a child, I had sat beside her and watched her sew without ever imagining that one day the sound of that machine would become the sound of survival. At first, I only used it because I could not afford to keep buying new clothes. Elsie's skin was incredibly sensitive, and some store-bought fabrics left angry red marks around her wrists and neck. Jonah was growing so fast that outfits fit one week and didn't the next. I dug through my mother's old fabric box, found the softest cotton she had left behind, and tried making a simple sleep set. The first one was crooked. The second one had a neckline that sat too loose. By the third, something shifted. It was no longer just about making clothes. It was about remembering that these hands could still create something of value. I embroidered a tiny white cloud on Elsie's chest. I softened the cuffs on Jonah's sleeves so they would not rub. When I dressed them in those little outfits, I did not just see two adorable babies. I saw children who looked loved, protected, carefully held together by the same woman who had been discarded and was still somehow standing. One afternoon, my neighbor Nora Bell came by and saw the twins in the outfits I had made. "Where did you buy those?" she asked immediately. When I told her I had made them, she stared at the stitching for a few seconds and then said, "Would you make one for my daughter?" I almost said no. I had no time, no proper supplies, and absolutely no belief that anyone would actually pay for baby clothes made by a broke single mother in a cramped kitchen. But Nora insisted, and I needed diaper money. So I made a dress for her little girl. A week later, Nora texted me that her daughter had worn it to a birthday party and 3 other mothers had asked for my number. That was how it started. One order, then another, then a few messages asking if I made soft pajamas for babies with skin irritation. During the day, I was still deep in bottles, laundry, thermometers, burp cloths, and sleep deprivation. At night, after my father took the babies for a little while, I sat at the kitchen table pinning patterns, cutting fabric, and sewing until my eyes blurred. My fingertips toughened. Some nights I fell asleep in the chair. But every time I finished one tiny outfit with a neat seam and a careful hem, I felt a small part of myself coming back to life. I named the brand Little Blessings. The name came to me one night just before dawn while Jonah was asleep against my chest, and Elsie's hand was wrapped around her brother's fingers in the crib. I looked at the two of them, then at the cramped kitchen that had become my workshop, and thought, maybe these little lives are the very blessings that forced me not to give up. I set up a free online storefront. I used my old phone to take product photos near the window with the best morning light. Jonah and Elsie became my first models. The backdrop was just a white cloth clipped to the wall. I had no advertising budget, no polished branding package, no investor, just a handful of soft, beautiful baby clothes made by a woman who had once been left with nothing. What surprised me was that people could feel that. Mothers wrote to say their babies slept better in the fabric. They said the seams did not scratch. They said the clothes felt simple, but tender and real. I read every message like a thirsty woman tasting water. Then a small children's boutique in the city ordered 10 pieces. I packed them so carefully, it felt like I was mailing away pieces of my own body. In every box, I placed a handwritten note. "Thank you for trusting something made with tenderness." 2 weeks later, that same store called to order 30 more. The owner was Miriam Frost. She invited me in to meet her. When I stepped into her shop, the place smelled like cedar and baby soap. She picked up one of my little sets, touched the collar, and then looked at me for a long moment. "You've been through something painful, haven't you?" she asked. I froze. "Why would you say that?" "Because whoever made this understands children," she said. "But she also understands the mothers who dress them. That kind of understanding doesn't come from a marketing book." Her words caught in my throat. Miriam did not make huge promises. She simply said that if I could keep the quality steady, she would introduce the line to a few other shops. At the time, that was already more than enough. For the first time, I started to think that Little Blessings might become something bigger than grocery money. It might become my way out. And then, just as I started to believe that, an old door opened again. A small design studio called me in for an interview for a part-time position. I went with my portfolio in hand and my heart pounding, thinking maybe I had not been erased from my old career after all. The interview was going well. They praised my previous design work. They liked my sense of color. They even said it was a shame I had been away from the field. Then the manager glanced at my file and asked, "You have infant twins? And no husband?" I stayed silent for 1 second too long. That was all it took. Her smile changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. "You're very talented," she said. "But this role requires a high degree of flexibility. I'm afraid your personal circumstances could make that difficult." Personal circumstances. I left with my portfolio still under my arm. It was drizzling when I stood under the bus shelter and the corner of the folder got wet. I looked at the projects that had once made me proud and for the first time understood that the door back into my old life was probably closed. Then my phone vibrated. I assumed it was my father texting about the babies. It wasn't. It was an email from another shop asking about wholesale orders for Little Blessings. A minute later, another message came in. A mother in the next city wanted to know if I could handle a larger custom order for a children's gift chain. I stood there in the rain, holding a soaked portfolio that represented everything I was losing, while my cracked phone screen lit up with signs of a different future. That was the moment I understood something important. Maybe the old door had closed, but another one was opening, and this new one did not require pity to let me through. What I did not know then was that around the same time, the name Adeline Rowe had started being mentioned again inside the Vale world, and they were not happy to hear that I had not disappeared. I did not have proof at first, only instinct. That instinct sharpened the day an anonymous account placed a rush order for 12 of my best-selling baby outfits, then canceled after I had already cut through most of the fabric I had set aside for the week. For a major brand, that would have been an inconvenience. For me, it was a financial chokehold. I stood over the cut fabric on my table and felt something cold slide through me. The account name was fake. The delivery address was vague. The phone number did not work. Everything about it was just suspicious enough to be impossible to pin down and far too timely to feel random. I did not tell my father. He had enough to carry already. I just repurposed the fabric into new pieces and forced myself not to let fear stain the work. But I knew somebody was watching. Somebody wanted to remind me that I was not supposed to grow too quickly. So instead of shrinking, I moved harder. I asked Paige Hollow, a young photographer Nora knew, to help me create a better photo set for Little Blessings. Paige agreed in exchange for a few handmade outfits for her niece. We took Jonah and Elsie to the park early one morning and photographed them under soft light, in the grass, between pale trees, wearing clothes I had made from the exact fabric that had almost been wasted by that canceled order. Those photos spread faster than I expected. Another store reached out. Then a regional retail chain called Hearth & Pine emailed to ask for a meeting. I almost stopped breathing when I read it. Hearth & Pine was not a giant corporation, but it was large enough that if Little Blessings made it onto their shelves, I would no longer be just a small online shop run from my father's kitchen. The meeting took place in a clean, bright office that smelled like coffee and printer paper. Their representative, Quentin Hale, was not warm exactly, but he was fair. He looked over every sample, ran his fingers over the seams, and asked the right questions. Fabric sourcing, production capacity, quality control, growth. I did not romanticize anything. I told him clearly that I did not have a large factory, just a small production arrangement and a hands-on process. I told him I would not sacrifice quality for speed. I told him Little Blessings had started because my daughter's skin reacted badly to mass-produced clothes, and I never wanted another baby to be uncomfortable inside something marketed as cute. Quentin listened carefully. Then he said, "You don't have scale yet, but you have something many bigger brands lose very early." "What's that?" I asked. "A soul." I did not know how to answer that. A week later, Hearth & Pine offered me a trial order for 12 stores. 12. I sat in my car after that meeting and cried in the parking lot, half laughing at the same time. 12 stores meant risk. It meant scaling faster, thinking bigger, managing more. But it also meant that Little Blessings had a chance to step out of my father's kitchen and become something real. So I threw myself into it. Nora came over in the evenings to help pack. My father picked up fabric rolls, made deliveries, and turned half the garage into storage space. I found 2 skilled seamstresses, sisters named Cora and June Whitmore, who agreed to help with overflow if I paid reliably. Our home became a half-functioning workshop, fabric stacked on the sofa, boxes under the table, order schedules taped to the refrigerator. It was chaotic and full of life. Then, just as I started to feel like I was finally walking through a real door into a bigger future, I received an anonymous envelope. No return address. Inside was a photograph. It showed me holding Jonah on the porch while Elsie sat in her stroller beside my father, taken from a distance. Someone had been watching our house. My hands went icy when I turned it over. On the back, in black ink, someone had written, "Some doors were meant to stay closed forever." I sat in the kitchen staring at that photograph while the washing machine ran in the next room and the clock ticked above the doorway. Everything around me was painfully ordinary, and yet it felt like ice had been poured down my spine. For the first time in years, I was truly afraid, not for myself, for my children. I locked every door, drew the curtains earlier than usual, stopped letting Jonah and Elsie play out on the porch. Every time a car slowed near the house, my heart pounded. I hated that feeling. Hated that the shadow of the Vale family could still stretch all the way to the place where I had finally started to feel safe. But that photograph was not the last move. A few days later, just as I was preparing to ship my first big order to Hearth and Pine, the part of my business that kept the money flowing was hit without warning. Someone tried to make Little Blessings disappear from the internet overnight. I opened my laptop on Monday morning and found my Little Blessings online store suspended. No warning, no time to prepare. Just a notification on the screen that read, "Account temporarily disabled due to reports of copyright infringement and unclear product sourcing." I stared at the sentence until my eyes hurt. If my online sales channel went down, I would lose the cash flow I needed to pay for fabric, labor, and shipping on my Hearth and Pine order. I did not have reserves. I did not have investors. A delay of a few days could sink everything. I filed an appeal immediately. I uploaded fabric invoices, sketches, sample development photos, customer correspondence, anything I had. The system replied with an automated message saying the review process could take 3 to 5 business days. 3 to 5 days. To other people, that would have been frustrating. To me, it was a cliff edge. I barely slept for 3 nights. During the day, I still had to care for the twins, check inventory, coordinate with the seamstresses, and keep working. At night, I sat cross-legged on the kitchen floor surrounded by paperwork, digging through old receipts, labeling design drafts, sending follow-up emails, documenting everything. I could feel the strategy in what had been done. The goal was not necessarily to win the accusation. The goal was to exhaust me. At around 3 a.m. on the second night, I found myself sitting among invoices and packing lists, hearing Elsie cough in the next room and my father shifting on the couch where he had fallen asleep helping with the babies, and for the first time in months, I wanted to break, but I could not. No one was coming to rescue me if I let go. I called Quentin to warn him that there might be a delay. I fully expected him to pull the order. I was a small brand with too much risk attached. Instead, he paused and asked, "Do you believe in your product?" "Yes," I said. "Then stop talking like someone who is already defeated. Send me a contingency plan if the account isn't restored in 3 days." That sentence hit me like a slap in the best possible way. 3 days later, the account came back online. The complaint was removed for lack of evidence. I nearly collapsed from relief. But before the relief had time to settle, another email landed in my inbox. No name, no subject line, just one sentence: "You're stubborn." That was the moment I knew for sure. None of this was random. Whoever was behind it knew exactly what I was going through. They knew the account had just been restored. They knew I had not collapsed the way they wanted me to. They were watching closely. I printed the email and put it in the same folder as the photograph. Then I went back to work. Not because I was no longer afraid, but because I understood something about people who like to push others against the wall. They wait for the moment you admit you are too weak to keep going. I was not going to give them that satisfaction. The first Hearth and Pine shipment went out on time. I stood in the yard and watched the truck doors close over boxes stamped with the name Little Blessings. Dust lifted under the morning sun. Nora hugged me. My father turned his face slightly as if he were looking at the sky, but I knew his eyes were wet. A week later, the first sales report came in. The line was outperforming projections, not just meeting them, exceeding them. Hearth and Pine wanted to increase their order for the next quarter. I thought for one bright moment that maybe I had finally clawed back some dignity from the hands of fate. I laughed more that day than I had in months. I even took Jonah and Elsie to the park and bought them tiny cups of ice cream as if we had really made it. Then my phone rang. A woman's voice, calm and cold, said, "Hello, I'm calling from the legal office representing the Vale family. Our clients are currently reviewing possible legal interests concerning the 2 children." I went completely still. All those years of silence, no calls, no support, no father showing up for fevers, nights, or milestones. And now, just when I had managed to stand, they were back. Not because they cared, Because I had not broken? I gripped the phone so hard it hurt. What do you want? At this time, it is only an evaluation, she replied. Further communication will follow. Then she ended the call. I stood in the kitchen, with Jonah and Elsie laughing behind me over a wooden spoon and toy pot, and looked at the order schedules, the invoices, the sample fabrics spread across the table. I understood something with terrifying clarity. This time, they were not coming for my business. They were coming for my children. I hired a lawyer that same day. His name was Elliot Shaw. He was not flashy. He did not have a gleaming office tower or a dramatic courtroom voice. He worked out of an older building with tidy shelves, a humming ceiling fan, and a clock that ran slightly slow. But 10 minutes into sitting across from him, I knew he was exactly the kind of person I needed. Calm, precise, and not in the habit of dismissing a woman's fear as overreaction. He listened to everything without interrupting much. Then he asked short, practical questions. Is Cedric listed on the birth certificates? No. Was there any formal child support arrangement? No, I refused to sign anything they offered. Do you still have letters, emails, or records connected to the abandonment? I bit my lip. Some, not all. That was when I fully felt the cost of survival mode. Back then, I had been too broken, too exhausted, and too consumed by keeping 2 infants alive to think like a woman preparing for future litigation. I had deleted things just to get through the day. Now I was paying for that. Elliot leaned back. It's not pretty, but a father does not get to vanish for years and then return as if he's reclaiming misplaced property. I wanted to hold on to that sentence, but on the drive home, watching Jonah and Elsie play on the rug in my father's living room, my chest still tightened. Jonah was stacking wooden blocks into a lopsided tower. Elsie was carefully laying a doll into a cardboard box like a crib. They knew nothing. They did not know they had once been rejected. They did not know someone now wanted back into their lives not because of fatherly love, but because of power, pride, or control. That night, after the twins were asleep, I opened the box I had avoided for years. Inside were a few wedding photos, a handful of cards Cedric had once written me, the letter that had come back unopened, and the hospital bracelet from the day I gave birth. Pieces of the past I had never quite been brave enough to throw away. My father passed by, saw the box open on the table, and fell silent for a long moment. Then he sat down across from me. I think it's time you knew about this, he said. He told me to go to the storage room and bring back a small, dark wooden box I had never paid attention to before. Inside was a sealed envelope, yellowed slightly with time. He told me that while I had still been in the hospital after giving birth, a young woman had approached him in the parking garage. She said she had once worked for the Vale family. She did not want her name attached to anything, but she believed I might one day need to know the truth. She gave him that envelope and told him to keep it sealed unless they ever tried to come back into my life. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside were copies of internal emails. Not many, but enough. Enough to show that the termination of my apartment lease, the lawyer's hospital visit, the quiet separation strategy, and the image management around Cedric's family life had all been discussed at least 2 weeks before I gave birth. Then I found the line that made me sit down. Cedric has agreed not to argue further. I read it once, then again. Cedric had agreed, not been cornered at the last minute, not panicked, not helpless. He had agreed. That was the moment an old wound split wider. For years, no matter how angry I had been, some tiny hidden part of me had still tried to believe Cedric had been weak, controlled, overwhelmed, but not entirely willing. That sentence killed the last of that illusion. He had not just failed me, he had participated. When Elliot reviewed the documents, he straightened in his chair. "This is not the end of the case," he said, "but it changes the balance. It shows premeditation." That night, Paige sent me a clipped video from one of the Vale charity galas. Vivienne was speaking on stage under soft lights about family values, supporting women, and responsibility toward future generations. I almost laughed. Then the camera moved. Cedric was standing behind her. It was only a few seconds, but it was enough. His face looked hollow, like a beautiful house that had been abandoned from the inside out. There was no glow of triumph on him, no peace, no satisfaction. I was surprised by what I felt, not sympathy, something colder, the realization that the cost of cowardice had finally started showing on the face of the man who had chosen it. And then, while I was still staring at the screen, another email appeared in my inbox. No threat, no mockery, just one line. "He saw you on television this morning?" I froze. I had not been on television. Then I remembered. A producer from a morning show had reached out 2 days earlier after a local article ran about little blessings. I had not answered yet. I had only been considering it. If Cedric had seen me, that meant someone on the other side knew more than I did. And for some reason, my gut told me something had already started to crack over there. I had not even gone on air yet, and somehow, someone inside the veil world was already rattled. I agreed to appear on Sunrise Table that same evening, not because I wanted to cry on television. I hate the way women's pain is sometimes polished into inspiration for daytime audiences, but the producer, Helena Pruitt, was clear that they wanted to focus on Little Blessings and the real journey behind it. Not names, not scandal, not revenge, just truth. I still hesitated. Public attention meant the Vale family could no longer pretend I did not exist. But then I thought about it differently. They had erased me from their story the moment it became inconvenient. If I kept hiding just to avoid making them uncomfortable, then I was still living by their rules. My father was the one who finally pushed me to say yes. He was sitting at the table fixing one of Jonah's toy wheels when he looked up and said, "You're not telling the story to punish anyone. You're telling it so you don't have to hide from it anymore." He was right. I did not need my past's permission to step into the light. The studio was colder than I expected. The backstage area smelled like powder and hairspray. They dressed me in a cream suit that fit perfectly, clean, elegant, not flashy. When I looked in the mirror, I had the strange feeling of seeing a version of myself I had not fully met yet. Not the woman crying over grocery prices in my father's kitchen, not some polished empire builder either. Just me, steadier. Helena greeted me with a quick, warm hug. Right before we went live, she asked, "What is the truest thing you want people to hear today?" I did not need long to answer. "That starting over is not graceful," I said. "It's messy, exhausting, humiliating, and painful, but it can still be done." Helena smiled. "That's exactly why you should be here." When I sat in that chair beneath those studio lights, I was not as nervous as I thought I would be. Maybe because I was not performing, I was just telling the truth. Helena asked how Little Blessings began. I told her about my mother's old sewing machine, about Elsie's sensitive skin, about sewing late at night in a cramped kitchen after the twins finally fell asleep, about the moment a woman realizes that nobody is coming to save her, and she has no choice but to build with whatever is left in her hands. I did not mention Cedric. I did not mention the Vale family. I did not detail the hospital betrayal. But I did not soften the pain either. I said there had been a time I thought my life was over. I said there had been a season when I felt like I had been pushed out of the world of people with money, power, and protection. And I said the turning point came when I stopped waiting to be chosen. I started living as if my life was something I had to build, I said, not something someone else could grant me. The studio went still. Then Helena asked the question I knew would become the clip people shared afterward. "If the person who hurt you the most is watching right now, what would you say?" My heart hit hard once in my chest. I could have dodged it. I could have smiled and played safe. I did not. "I would say thank you," I replied. Not because they treated me kindly, but because the day they turned their backs on me, I understood that if I didn't save myself, no one would. And from that moment on, I stopped living to be chosen. There was a brief silence. Then the audience applauded. That applause did not make me feel victorious. It made me feel lighter. Lighter because my story finally belonged to me. After the segment aired, everything exploded faster than I could process. Little Blessings website traffic surged. Orders poured in. My inbox filled with messages from women telling me they had also been abandoned, overlooked, dismissed, or forced to rebuild. Many said they cried when I said I had stopped living to be chosen. I read those messages with trembling hands. That same afternoon, Elliot called. The Vale family had just suspended all legal action involving Jonah and Elsie. I went still. "Why?" I asked. "They didn't say," Elliot replied, "but something shifted over there. Someone inside the family changed the game." Before I could fully absorb that, another email appeared in my inbox. No signature, no subject, just one line. "He watched the show, and he wants to see you." Cedric. He had seen me on television. He had seen that I had not just survived. I had stood up, built something, spoken calmly about the day he left me as if it no longer had the power to destroy me. And for the first time in years, he wanted to come back into the story. I stared at my phone for a long time, not with the fury I had imagined, just with the strange, hollow feeling of someone hearing that the person who once burned down her house now wants to stand at the front door and talk. But what I did not expect was that Cedric would not wait for me to agree. He came looking for me anyway, and the moment he stepped into my workshop, I knew this was no longer about a simple apology. Cedric showed up late one cold afternoon while I was at the new Little Blessings workshop reviewing samples with Cora and June. The building was an old warehouse I had renovated with exposed brick, tall windows, and enough natural light to make the whole place feel alive. It was not glamorous in the way anything the Vales owned was glamorous, but it was the first space in my life that felt entirely, unquestionably mine. Seeing Cedric standing inside it felt almost offensive. Nora was the one who came to warn me. "There's someone here to see you," she said, her face hard to read, "and I think this one should be your decision." I walked out to the reception area. Cedric was there. He was still impeccably dressed, but something about him had changed. He no longer carried the quiet confidence of a man who believed the world would always open for him. His shoulders were more tired. There were shadows under his eyes. He looked like someone who had not slept properly in a long time. I did not invite him to sit. "What are you doing here?" He looked at me for a long moment before saying, "I came to apologize." A short laugh escaped me before I could stop it. It was not kind. "You've got the wrong address. The flower shop is down the block." He nodded as if he had expected something like that. "I'm not here for sympathy. I just needed to tell you I was wrong." "I know you were wrong," I said. "The question is why you're here now." He drew in a breath. "Because now I finally have the courage to look at what I did." That answer made me colder, not softer. "No," I said. "Now you can finally see that I didn't die. I didn't disappear. I didn't spend the rest of my life quietly fading like an embarrassing mistake you could remove from the picture." He flinched. I stepped a little closer. "You think I don't know? I saw the emails. I know everything was arranged before I gave birth. I know the apartment lease was cut early. I know the lawyer came to the hospital with papers already drafted. I know you agreed." His face changed instantly. All the color went out of him. "You have documents?" he asked. "I have enough to know I wasn't abandoned by a man who panicked in one bad moment. I was betrayed by a husband who knew exactly what he was doing." Cedric did not argue, did not deny it, did not reach for some excuse. That almost made it worse. For years, I had imagined every possible confrontation, but now the man who once had the power to shatter me stood there, looking like the ghost of his own choices. "After the interview," he said quietly, "I started digging, talking to people who used to work for my family, looking at old files. I found out my mother did more than I knew." I crossed my arms. Should that surprise me? He pulled a thick envelope from inside his coat. "This might." I did not take it immediately. "What is it?" "Internal emails, notes, correspondence with consultants, documents showing some of the things my mother did to cut off your opportunities." My fingers tightened. "Be specific." He met my eyes for the first time. "My mother didn't just want you out of the family. She wanted you too exhausted to stand back up. Some of the places that rejected you, some of the business contacts who stopped returning calls, some of the delays and strange resistance when your business started growing, maybe not all of it, but enough of it was her." My blood seemed to go cold. The closed doors, the unanswered emails, the vanished contacts, the polite rejections that had never fully made sense. I had spent years telling myself it was bad luck, or the price of being a single mother in a world that likes tidy stories. It wasn't. Someone had been reaching ahead of me, quietly putting a hand against the next door before I could get to it. "Why are you giving this to me now?" I asked. Cedric gave a faint, exhausted smile. "Because I was a coward, and because it took me far too long to understand that silence in the face of cruelty does not make you innocent." I took the envelope. It was heavier than I expected. Inside were email copies, meeting notes, communication from a reputation management firm, and enough material to show a very clear line. Vivian had treated removing me from Cedric's life like a strategic image problem, not just abandonment, erasure. I looked up. "What do you want from me?" He shook his head. "Not another chance. I have no right to ask for that. I just want to stop her from having any control over you or the children." I did not believe him automatically, but I believed the papers in my hand. "Can you authenticate this?" "Yes." "Are you willing to stand against your mother?" He was silent for a second, then said, "I've already withdrawn every legal move regarding the twins, and I'm leaving the company." I stared at him. Part of me wanted to ask the question that had haunted me for years. If you can do this now, why couldn't you do it then? But there was no point. I already knew the answer, because back then he had chosen what was easier, and the easy choice had destroyed us. I closed the envelope. "Fine," I said. "If you truly want this to end, then we're not stopping at an apology." He nodded slowly. "I know." I stepped back, keeping the exact distance his absence had built between us. "Then get ready," I said. "Because this time, you're going to sit across from your mother and listen to her say out loud exactly who she is." Something flickered in Cedric's face then. For the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. Not fear of losing money, not fear of scandal, fear of finally having to look directly at the woman who had made him. I took the entire file Cedric had given me straight to Elliot's office that night. He read through everything carefully. He did not rush. He did not overreact. But the more pages he turned, the tighter his face became. Some of the documents lived in a legal gray area. A few were fragments, but taken together, they showed a pattern. After pushing me out of the Vale family, Vivian had quietly interfered with my ability to rebuild. She had influenced professional doors, delayed business opportunities, and tried to keep me too busy surviving to rise. "This," Elliot said, setting the stack down, "may not be enough to destroy someone in court by itself, but it is more than enough to make them very uncomfortable if handled correctly." I sat there in silence, feeling the weight of it press into my chest. Living through suffering is one thing. Realizing later that parts of that suffering were engineered is something else entirely. It changed the color of old memories. The closed doors were no longer misfortune. They had fingerprints on them. "What do you want to do?" Elliot asked. That was the real question. I could have gone public. I could have fed the whole thing to the press and let the Vale name drown in it. But if I did that, Jonah and Elsie would be dragged into the story too. It would stop being mine and become a spectacle. I did not want that. "I want boundaries," I said. "I want her to stop. Completely. Permanently. I want every legal move involving the twins withdrawn. I want written assurances that she will never interfere with my business or personal life again. And," I paused, "I want her to hear me say it." Elliot leaned back and thought for a moment. A formal meeting, lawyers present, recorded, terms made explicit. "I want her to lose the ability to pretend she doesn't know what she's done." Cedric agreed to act as an authenticating source for the materials he had brought. That did not soften me toward him, but it meant that for once, he was willing to pay the price of standing on the right side of the truth. The meeting was arranged in a neutral office in the city. Vivian initially refused. Then she accepted. I knew her type well enough by then. People like that always believe that if they appear in person with enough poise and force, the other person will shrink on instinct. She probably still pictured me as the younger version of myself, the daughter-in-law who swallowed humiliation at long candlelit dinners under crystal chandeliers. On the morning of the meeting, I wore a navy suit tailored close to the body, pinned my hair back, and put on the small pearl earrings my father had given me the day Little Blessings signed its first expansion contract. I dropped Jonah and Elsie off at school like every other day, fixing Elsie's coat button and reminding Jonah not to run in the hallway. That ordinary school morning routine kept me steadier than any pep talk could have. The conference room had frosted glass walls, a long wooden table, and the smell of dark coffee and fresh printouts. Vivian arrived exactly on time in a silver gray dress and her usual pearl necklace. To anyone else, she still looked like elegance itself. That was part of what made her dangerous. She wore cruelty beautifully. She sat down, placed her handbag beside her chair, looked at me once, and asked, "What is it you want?" No greeting, no small talk. I answered in an even voice, "I want you to stop violating my life." Vivian lifted an eyebrow, as though the statement were too emotional to be worth taking seriously. You're exaggerating. Elliot slid the file toward her. We don't believe she is. Vivian opened it, flipped through a few pages, and barely changed expression. Only her thumb hesitated once at the edge of a document. If you weren't paying attention, you would have missed it. These materials are fragmented, she said, and your interpretation is rather emotional. I looked at her. After you got what you wanted, why did you keep going? Her eyes met mine, cool and almost amused. Because you were the mistake he wasn't decisive enough to correct. The room went still. That sentence landed like a blade on the table, and then the door opened. Cedric walked in. I had not warned her. Neither had Elliot. Vivian turned sharply, and for the first time in all the years I had known her, I saw the mask crack just a little. Cedric pulled out a chair and sat across from her. Mother, he said, his voice rough but clear, I'm here to do what I should have done years ago. Vivian stared at him as if she did not recognize her own son. What are you doing here? He did not look away. Standing with the truth. I sat between the woman who had once decided my fate and the man who had once been too weak to protect me, and I understood with perfect clarity. This was no longer about convincing anyone that I deserved dignity. This was the moment the two people who had built my destruction were finally going to face what they had made. I looked directly at Vivienne. You already won once, I said. You got your son. You got your silence. You got your spotless family image. Why wasn't that enough? She smiled coldly. Because you never understood your place. Cedric turned toward her. No, because you cannot bear the idea of anyone existing outside your control. Her stare cut to him. The air in the room hardened. And that was when Elliot's hand moved lightly toward the recording pen sitting on the table. Vivian saw it. Her eyes narrowed. She understood, too late. For the first time in her life, she had spoken her real nature aloud in front of people who were no longer afraid of her. After that sentence, the balance in the room shifted completely. Vivian still held herself beautifully, back straight, chin slightly raised, pearl necklace resting at her throat like it belonged there by law. But I could see it now, her eyes sharpening, the pauses between her words stretching longer, the attorney beside her no longer carrying the easy confidence of someone who had come in expecting to dismiss a hysterical ex. Elliot spoke first. He did not dramatize anything. He simply laid out the facts. Interference in my professional opportunities, delayed legal action concerning the children after years of abandonment, indirect threats, and significant legal exposure if the pattern continued. Vivian's attorney interrupted only twice, and both times the documents answered for themselves. Then it was my turn. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I did not recount every sleepless night or humiliating rejection. That kind of pain does not move people like Vivian. The only thing that moves them is a door closing in front of them. I am demanding the permanent withdrawal of any legal action involving Jonah and Elsie, I said. I am demanding a written commitment that neither you nor anyone acting on your behalf will contact, monitor, pressure, or interfere with my children, my business, my reputation, my partners, or my private life in any way. Any future communication, if there is any at all, goes through my legal counsel. Vivian looked at me like she had just heard something absurd. You think you're in a position to dictate terms? I held her gaze. I'm exactly in that position. The room almost seemed to freeze. Then Cedric spoke. You should sign. Vivian turned sharply toward him. Be quiet. No, Cedric said. I've been quiet long enough. I will never forget the way he said that. Not boldly, not theatrically, just with the exhausted clarity of a man finally understanding how much damage his silence had done. Vivian gave a small laugh, the kind you give a child who has said something foolish. I raised you to understand responsibility. Cedric looked at her for a long time. No, he said. You raised me to fear going against you, and then you called that responsibility. Her attorney stopped writing. Elliot said nothing, but I noticed him glance briefly toward the recording device. Then Vivian stood. If you continue siding with her in this humiliation, don't expect there to be a place for you in this family. Cedric stood too, slower than she had, as if he wanted no escape route left in what he was about to say. If this family only exists by demanding that I abandon my wife and children, he said, then I don't want a place in it. No one moved. I didn't look at Cedric, I looked at Vivian. And in that moment, I finally saw what she truly feared. Not me, not the documents, not even public shame. She feared losing total control over the son she had shaped to function as an extension of herself. The meeting did not end with a signature that same day. Someone like Vivian would never allow herself to appear cornered in a single afternoon. She left with her face composed and frozen, her attorney behind her, while Cedric stood still in the room like a man who had just walked out of a house he once believed he could never leave. 2 days later, their side sent over the first settlement draft. Elliot revised almost everything. More boundaries, more language, more consequences. A week later, the final version was signed. Vivian did not apologize. I did not need her to. I did not need a confession from the woman who had once looked at me like dirt beneath her shoes. I needed her to lose the right to reach into my life, and I got that. Rumors began to leak quietly through financial circles. No article said anything directly, but the phrasing changed. Internal restructuring, differences in strategic direction, questions surrounding succession. Cedric stepped back from several key positions. The family showed up at fewer events. There were fewer photographs, fewer polished smiles, nothing obvious, but enough for people who knew how to read between the lines. As for me, I did not take it any further. I did not need to burn the Vale family to the ground in order to feel restored. I only needed them to stop touching my life. Cedric sent me a handwritten letter through Elliot, just 1 page. No plea to come back. No speech about his suffering, no attempt to make his guilt the center of the story. He simply wrote that he had left the estate, refused the inheritance tied to operational control of the company, and moved into a small apartment. He did not know what his future was anymore. He did not know whether he deserved forgiveness. Probably not. But for the first time in his life, he wanted to live by decisions he was willing to answer for. When I finished reading it, I did not feel triumphant. I felt a different kind of grief, because years earlier, if he had possessed even a fraction of the courage he was showing now, then my children and I would never have had to survive what we did. But too late is still too late, and just as Cedric was beginning to live with the emptiness he had created, Little Blessing stepped into a whole new chapter, and fate arranged for him to see it in the most painful possible way. From outside a door he no longer had the right to walk through. The morning Little Blessings opened its first flagship store. I woke up at 5 even though I had barely slept, not because I was afraid anything would go wrong. My team had prepared too carefully for that, but because I knew this day would close so many chapters at once. That store was not just a business expansion, it was proof. Proof that the woman who had once been left in a hospital with newborn twins had not merely survived. She had built a life strong enough to welcome others into it. The store sat on a central street, but it was not flashy. I designed the entire space myself. Pale woods, soft linen, warm lighting, low displays at a child's eye level, a small reading nook, cushioned benches for mothers, and a wall behind the register engraved with the words, "Made with tenderness for the small lives we hold." I wanted people to walk in and feel that this was not a place selling adorable things for children. It was a place selling gentleness. My father wore an old suit he had tailored again for the occasion and kept looking around as though he still could not believe the place was real. Nora ran back and forth between flower arrangements and guest lists. Paige was everywhere with her camera. Miriam arrived with a cream-colored bouquet and said, "I always knew you'd get here. I just didn't think it would be this soon." Jonah and Elsie were beyond excited. I had dressed them in outfits designed specially for the opening. Jonah in a soft cream knit set, his hair neatly brushed for all of 5 minutes. Elsie in a velvet pinafore in muted blue-gray, clinging to my leg 1 second and darting away the next. Looking at them standing inside a space I had imagined and built, I had to turn away more than once because I was afraid I would cry hard enough to ruin my makeup. Everything was going beautifully. Then, just before the ribbon cutting, I looked out through the front glass. Cedric was standing across the street. He did not come in. He did not send flowers. He did not call ahead. He did not create a scene or find some excuse to insert himself into the moment. He simply stood under a bare branch tree on the opposite sidewalk with his hands in the pockets of a dark coat, looking through the glass like a man who knew he no longer had the right to interrupt what was inside. I looked at him for a few seconds. Then I handed the ceremonial scissors to Nora and told her I would be right back. It was colder outside than I expected. The air smelled like roasted coffee from the cafe on the corner and pine from the holiday wreath near the door. Cedric watched me approach, his shoulders tightening slightly as if he were bracing for impact. "You shouldn't be here," I said. "I know," he replied. "I just needed to see this with my own eyes." I said nothing. Cedric looked through the glass at the store. Jonah was trying to climb onto a bench to wave at his grandfather. Elsie was holding a small bouquet from Miriam and smiling at Paige's camera. My staff moved through the space with purpose and ease. The whole room glowed with something I once would not even have dared to describe out loud. "It's more beautiful than anything I ever inherited," Cedric said quietly. That sentence hurt in a way I had not expected, maybe because it was true. He pulled a small parcel from his coat pocket, wrapped in plain brown paper. "2 illustrated books for the children," he said. "That's all, just books." I looked at the parcel and did not take it right away. "I'm not here to ask for another chance," he continued. "I understand now that some doors don't reopen. I just wanted to tell you, I'm proud of you." I looked directly at him. "You don't have the right to be." He nodded once. "I know." A gust of cold wind sent dry leaves skittering over the pavement. I looked at the man in front of me and was surprised to realize that I no longer felt the old rage burning the way I once imagined I would. Not because he deserved forgiveness, but because he no longer occupied enough space in my life for that kind of fury. I took the gift, not for him, for the 2 children who had done nothing wrong in the wreckage their parents had inherited. Then I said very clearly, "Cedric, you need to hear this once and for all. You are no longer part of my life." His eyes reddened almost immediately, but he did not argue. He just nodded. "I know," he said. I turned to go, then stopped without looking back. "Money doesn't make a person empty, Cedric," I said. "Cowardice does." This time he had no answer. I went back inside. The moment the door closed behind me, the warmth returned. Jonah wrapped himself around my leg. Elsie lifted her flowers up for me to hold. My father met my eyes from across the room and somehow knew, just from looking, that I had said everything I needed to say. I took the scissors, cut the ribbon, the room filled with applause, and in that moment, standing inside the glow of warm lights, children's laughter, new wood, and butter cookies, I understood what real karma looked like. It was not seeing the person who hurt you fall to their knees. It was living so brightly that all they could do was stand outside and look in. But the final confrontation with the Vale family was not completely over yet, because 3 days after the opening, I got a call from the one person I never thought would ask to see me alone. Vivian Vale wanted a private meeting. When Elliot told me Vivian Vale wanted to meet me privately, my first reaction was to laugh. Not with amusement. It was the laugh of someone being told that the storm that once tore down her house now wanted to sit politely over tea and talk. Elliot advised me not to go. The agreement was already signed. The boundaries were already in place. Legally, I owed Vivian nothing. He told me that if I wanted to refuse completely, he would handle it for me. But I thought about it all night. Not because I was curious about what she wanted to say. I was fairly certain I could guess, and not because I expected an apology. I was no longer that naive. I went for a different reason. I wanted to look that woman in the eyes one final time when she no longer had the power to decide anything in my life. We met in a private tea room in an old hotel downtown. The place was quiet, elegant, full of dark wood and black tea and old money in exactly the way Vivian always liked. When I walked in, she was already seated near the window in an ivory dress, pearls at her throat, posture immaculate. No one looking at her from across the room would guess that she had once orchestrated the slow destruction of another woman's life just to preserve her family's image. Vivian stood when she saw me, and for the first time in all the years I had known her, I noticed that she had aged, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to comment on. But I could see it. The lines around her eyes were deeper, her shoulders a little thinner, and there was tension in the way she held herself upright, as though her body had learned to stay composed even while something inside it had begun to crack. "I didn't think you'd come," she said. "I didn't think I would either," I replied. We sat. Tea was poured. The server left. Vivian did not waste much time. Maybe when people who are used to controlling everything begin losing enough of that control, they stop having the patience for elegant performance. "Cedric has really left," she said. I looked at her and did not answer. His work, His place in things is not what it was. Many things have changed. Did you call me here to update me on your family? She paused. I called because I want to understand why you are so determined not to give him any chance at all. I almost could not believe what I was hearing. You think I owe you that answer? I simply wanted— What? I cut in. To understand why the woman you arranged to be abandoned, evicted, cut off, monitored, threatened, and erased is not opening her arms to welcome your son back? Vivian tightened her fingers around her teacup. You always had a tendency to dramatize things. It was strange. I did not feel the old rush of heat anymore. Maybe because when you are truly free of someone, you no longer need them to admit what they did in order to feel at peace. I think you still understand nothing, I said. The issue was never whether Cedric regrets it now. The issue is that there was a day when he looked at his wife, who had just given birth, and 2 newborn children, and chose to walk away. After that day, the man I loved no longer existed. Only the consequences did. Vivian was silent. I went on. You have always told yourself you were protecting your family. What you were really protecting was your power, and the price you made other people pay for that was enormous. I did what needed to be done, she said, but her voice was thinner now. No, I said. You did what you wanted to do, and then you called it necessary. For the first time, Vivian did not answer immediately. She looked out the window at the traffic sliding below like cold streaks of light. Then she asked slowly, So, what do you want from me now? That was when I knew how far I had really come. Once upon a time, I thought this moment would make me feel victorious. The woman who had cornered me now sitting in front of me, asking what I wanted. But when it actually happened, all I felt was tired. I don't want anything from you, I said. That's the part you can't bear. She turned to look at me. I don't need your approval. I don't need your respect. I don't need you to declare me worthy. I have my life. I have my children. I have the work I built with my own hands. You are no longer holding anything I need to come back and ask for. Her throat moved once. You think you've won? I shook my head. This isn't a competition, but if you truly need to know who lost, the answer is simple. I looked right at her. The person who loses is the one who has everything and still doesn't know how to love anyone without controlling them. Vivian sat very still. Then I stood. She stood too, almost on instinct, as though she was afraid I might leave without handing her some kind of final, gracious exit. Adeline, she said. I turned. For one brief second, I thought I might finally hear an apology. Not because I needed it, but because life sometimes enjoys the cruelty of letting people understand too late. But Vivian only said, He really did love you. I looked at her and gave the faintest smile. Maybe, I said, but love that doesn't protect you is only a weak feeling. It is not a place you can live. Then I walked out without looking back. When I stepped onto the hotel stairs, the light was fading into evening. I stood there for a moment, looking at the city moving around me, and realized I had just walked out of my final meeting with the past carrying nothing but relief. The years that followed grew into something more beautiful than any revenge fantasy I could have imagined. Little blessings expanded, not recklessly, not for show. I grew it at a pace I could still control. I hired more women who had once been pushed into corners, single mothers, women rebuilding after loss, women other people dismissed as too complicated. I created a small training fund to help them learn sewing, fulfillment, and online retail skills. I did not build an empire. I built a place where people could begin again without being ashamed of the cracks in their story. Jonah grew into a warm, thoughtful boy who asked questions that sometimes broke my heart. Once he asked me, if a grown-up does something wrong because they're scared, does that make them bad? I held him close, smelled the clean sweetness in his hair, and said, not everyone who does wrong out of fear is bad, but when someone knows they are hurting people and stays silent anyway, they can do a lot of damage. Elsie asked less, but felt more. One evening she brought me a drawing of our family. Me, her, Jonah, and her grandfather in front of a house with glowing windows. I asked, is anyone missing? She tilted her head, thought for a second, and said, no, this is warm enough. I cried after she went to sleep. My father got older, more gray, slower steps, but every time he heard the twins race in from school, his eyes still brightened like they had the first day he held them. Some evenings he sat on the porch looking at the light in the windows and said quietly, your mother would be proud. Every time he said that, I thought about her sewing machine. now placed in the most beautiful corner of my design room as a reminder that what saved me was never a man coming back. It was me. As for Cedric, he kept his word. He did not cross boundaries. He did not force contact. Sometimes, through Elliot, he sent the children a birthday book or a card. I decided what they saw and what they did not. That was a right I had earned through every year I carried what he had chosen not to. I stopped counting what the Vale family lost. I stopped measuring Cedric's regret. That is a strange kind of freedom, when the person who once hurt you no longer matters enough for their suffering to shape your mourning. If someone asked me what the message of this story is, I think it would be simple. Women are not strong because they were born wanting to be strong. They are strong because sometimes life leaves them no gentler option. And the most beautiful revenge is not dragging someone down. It is living so fully, so brightly, that the people who once wanted to bury you can do nothing but look up. Cedric once told me we did not belong in the same world. In the end, he was right. His world back then was built on money, power, fear, and obedience. Mine was built on sleepless nights, calloused hands, swallowed tears, love for two small children, and the painstaking work of stitching my self-respect back together until it became stronger than steel. If you ask me whether I forgave, I would answer like this: I do not carry hatred forever, but letting go does not mean reopening the door. I let go so I could be lighter. I keep my boundaries so my life can stay peaceful. A few years later, on New Year's Eve, I stood in the house I had bought with my own money. Jonah was asleep on the sofa with a book upside down on his chest. Elsie was curled around her stuffed rabbit. My father had dozed off in his armchair, his glasses slipping down his nose. The Christmas lights were glowing softly against the wall. The kitchen still smelled like butter cookies. I moved quietly through the room, pulling a blanket over my father, lifting the book from Jonah's chest, smoothing Elsie's hair back from her face. Then I stood in the middle of that warm, quiet house and understood what real victory actually is. It is not being richer than the people who once looked down on you. It is not forcing them to kneel. It is building a home where nobody has to beg to be allowed to stay. I was abandoned on what should have been the happiest day of my life. But they got one thing wrong. They thought pushing me down was the end. It was only the place where I began. And the most beautiful karma of all was this: I became so undeniably happy that the past was no longer big enough to block my light.